Rob.
Brilliant. We'll get going then. Okay, so thank you everyone for tuning in. It's not quite the completion seminar I had in mind, being back at MGSE, but coming to you live from Brompton, South Australia. So we'll see how we go over the next 40 minutes. I'll be talking about the provision, reception, the evaluation of coach feedback in a high performance sports setting. So this is my last 3.5 years of work. And I'd like to thank, to start off with, John and Damien for being fantastic supervisors over the last 3.5 years, and Field for being a very supportive and interested chair of my committee, even if it's just to get some evidence for his Melbourne Football Club and try and improve their practice. So, without further ado, here are some of the big ticket items, some of the big questions that I'll be answering over the next 35, 40 minutes. So, does coach knowledge equal coach practice? So are there differences between what coaches say they do and what they actually do? Does feedback given equal feedback received? So this question has been asked in education. Is it the same in sport? How does feedback vary based on the context? So is there consistency between coaches giving athletes feedback in training versus in the heat of a game? And also, how can we differentiate feedback? So considering the individual feedback characteristics of the learner and what they bring to the interaction. So a wise person once told me, if there was a time to be self-indulgent, it's certainly in a completion seminar. Here's 30 seconds about me and what's led me to this series of studies. Here I am as a 16-month-old with my father, Wayne, who was my first model of what a good coach looked like. So he coached me in track and field. I was a very average 400-meter runner, but that was where I kind of got my interest in sport from. I tried my hand at coaching myself when I moved over to Melbourne and coached for 4 or 5 years in basketball. And then over the last 4 years, I've been involved with the Port Adelaide Football Club as a coach developer. So helping the coaches there with the way that they give feedback and the way that they teach. So all these experiences have kind of led to this project. So why actually study coach feedback? Well, it's a powerful effect on student achievement. So it can have really strong effects on learning and performance measures. In John's Visible Learning book, which pulls meta-analytic evidence on classroom achievement, the combined effect size of feedback studies was 0.73, which puts it in the top 10 most powerful effects on student achievement. But feedback effects can also be widely variable. So up to 1/3 of those effects are actually negative. And that raises questions about why. So feedback can be powerful, but how can we best support our coaches to harness the power of feedback in its best form? Feedback, and particularly coach to athlete feedback, is also a real world problem. Here's a 20-second snippet from the coach's box from the Western Bulldogs in 2009 with Rodney Eade as head coach. There's a little bit of crass language in there, so you'll have to excuse that. This is certainly not an everyday occurrence in the coach's box, but it definitely happens when the pressure is high. So it represents a great example of why this field is important.
Come on, Mitch! Right. Fucking work, Mitch! So is he just not working hard?
No,
fuck you, Will!
No, he's round the window.
Right, okay.
Unless we just sack that.
No. Fucking run, Will! Give it off, quick! Rocker, we can't think. All right. Come on. Okay. Come on, Mitch, again!
So 20-second snippet that provides an insight into maybe some ways that we can improve coach practice. This is certainly not what every coach does in every game, but this kind of feedback is less than ideal for progressing a learner's sense of achievement or their performance. So how can we improve this? That's a huge question for this thesis. And the other reason I really wanted to study coach feedback was because there are several gaps in the field. So I'll cover these in a little more depth throughout the literature review. Right, what does the literature say on feedback? So one of the first ways it was studied in sport coaching specifically was through coach observation studies. So researchers watch coaches in their natural environment and code their behaviours. So this came out of classroom analysis from the 1970s. And the first coach observation study was on John Wooden, a highly successful college basketball coach, who you can see there on the screen. This was done in 1976, and the researchers found that feedback made up a quarter of John Wooden's behaviours in a training setting. Now, it's a good time to define what feedback actually is. I could spend 40 minutes talking about it, but for the purpose of this presentation, let's call it information given to a learner related to some aspect of their learning or performance. So we'll find out a bit more about what feedback is as we consider some of the ways that we can code it. There have been two major reviews of these coach observation studies, and they provide a nice example of, or a nice bit of evidence about some of the gaps in the field. So a majority of these studies look at coaching behaviours during a training setting to the exclusion of competition settings or other environments where feedback can be given. Now, this is problematic because evidence suggests that coaches change their behaviour between training and competition. So each of those settings provides unique challenges. You can see there on the slide, on the top picture, there's a coach providing some video feedback to their athletes using video on the screen supplemented with verbal feedback and potentially some questions. And then down the bottom, you can see the coach's box, where a coach will have a phone to provide feedback down to the players on the ground. So there's very little evidence from a teaching and a feedback perspective about what happens in each of these contexts. So there's also an inconsistency in the use of coding schemes that was found in the two major reviews of coach observation literature. So the most prominent schemes only really include a simple positive or negative or a praise and scold category for feedback. And while we're at it, definition of positive and negative feedback, we're just going to call it feedback that evaluates performance positively or negatively. And this can be directed to different aspects of the task or the learner themselves, and we'll cover that in more detail on the next slide. So most coding schemes don't really consider several prominent modern theories of feedback, and an example of this you can see coded on the slide there is autonomy supportive feedback, which provides choice to the athlete, doesn't force them to think or behave in a certain way, and isn't directed to the athlete as a person, but is instead directed to their performance. And the opposite of autonomy supportive is controlling feedback. So an important note here when looking at rates of feedback and the evidence for their effectiveness is that lots of this evidence comes from lab-based studies. So maybe moving a lever to control a cursor on the screen. So it's a long way removed from the practical setting of a coach giving an athlete feedback in a game, for example. So any reference in this presentation to best practice feedback should be taken with a grain of salt, just because so much of this evidence is taken from a setting that isn't in a sporting environment, but it might be from a motor control study, for example. So we don't know a lot about effective feedback in a real world sporting environment, which is a great reason to do a PhD on it. So we also don't know a lot about what coaches know about feedback. And this seems important given that their beliefs and their knowledge probably underpin their subsequent behaviours. We do know that up to 60% of coaches believe in learning styles, which has been fairly systematically trashed in the literature over the last 10 or 15 years. But we don't know a lot else about their skills in teaching or their beliefs and their knowledge in teaching, at least. So this is another massive gap in the literature. In terms of evidence from education, going back through some theoretical approaches to feedback, it was at the heart of Thorndike and Skinner's work on behaviorism in the early 1900s, the classic rats pushing levers for food, classical and operant conditioning. The 1960s saw cognitive psychology come through, and feedback began to be considered not just as motivation, but also as information to correct errors and alter future attempts at a task. And then towards the later part of the 20th century, we saw constructivist perspectives emerging, and a fairly influential model of feedback that's come about in the last 10 or 15 years has been Hattie and Timperley's 4-level model of feedback, in which feedback is classified into its area of focus. So feedback can be directed towards the self as a learner, good boy, good girl, can be directed towards the task that the learner's undertaking, the processes that the learner is engaged with in undertaking the task, or also at the self-regulation level, so helping the learner to become more self-autonomous. Now, this feedback coding scheme has been used a few times in the classroom, but it hasn't been used in a sporting setting. So feedback reception is another massive gap in the field. So there's a common criticism that feedback research typically considers feedback given to a learner without also considering the factors that the learner brings to the interaction. So feedback given doesn't always equal feedback received is a common catch cry that you hear in the education circles. So one study coming out of Portugal found that up to 31% of coach to athlete feedback isn't recalled when athletes are interviewed directly after a judo match. So athletes are forgetting quite a bit of the feedback that they're receiving throughout a judo match. And then in the medical field, one of my favorite findings throughout doing the lit review for this thesis was that 91% of surgeons reported they were successful at giving effective feedback, but only 17% of the residents that received this feedback agreed. So there's a massive discrepancy there between feedback given and feedback received, at least in the perceptions of its quality. So why would this discrepancy be the case? One of the things that has been proposed in the literature is this idea of learner characteristics. So things like the working memory of the learner and their ability to attend to and retain information, their orientation towards receiving feedback, or their self-efficacy, how confident they feel in using feedback. So one nice study by Buzzard and colleagues found that when learners were giving 5 identical instructions, those in a higher working memory capacity group showed consistent improvements on this basketball shooting task than those in a low working memory capacity group. So this shows working memory might play an important role in an athlete's ability to use verbal direction to change performance. There was a major meta-analysis done on feedback research in '96, and that considers learner personality variables to be an important influence on feedback effectiveness. So things like the learner's self-efficacy or their belief that they can use feedback, and also their orientation towards receiving the feedback. So these aren't yet tested in a sporting environment. So the major gaps: we don't know what coaches know about feedback. We don't know what their beliefs are about what effective feedback might look like. We don't know a whole heap about feedback in different contexts. So from training to a competition to that off-field video feedback setting that we saw on the screen earlier. And we also don't know how feedback is received very well in a sample of athletes. So the aims and the questions for this thesis: what is coach knowledge about feedback? What do coaches know? What do they believe about the provision, the reception, the evaluation of feedback? What does feedback look like in a video feedback meeting? What does it look like in a competition setting? This will help supplement all of those training studies that we've seen in the coach observation literature. And it also sought to investigate athlete reception of feedback. So here's the study design for the 3 studies of the thesis. So it was overall a mixed methods approach. The first study looked at interviewing coaches and finding out what they knew about feedback. We'll go into more detail about each of these as we go. The second study, a mixed methods approach, where I observed coaches giving feedback in a video feedback setting, and then also assessed athlete reception of that feedback and tested a few learner characteristics along the way. And study 3, we looked at in-game feedback. So how does the feedback change in a competition setting? So the first study, I recruited 8 high-performance coaches. So that's or team sport high-performance coaches who've spent at least 5 years at the national level. So that's either a national level franchise like an AFL or an NRL team, or an Australian representative team. They were from the sports of rugby, basketball, AFL, hockey, and soccer. I conducted semi-structured interviews with them where I asked them questions like, how do you know the athletes receive the feedback you've given them? And what are some barriers to your athletes not using the feedback you've given them? And I was trying to really tap into their practical knowledge and beliefs about feedback. So there have been some nice examples of doing this in other fields. For example, for strength coaches, researchers have interviewed them about what they believe about resistance training. But this has never been done for coaches and teaching or feedback. And it's an important first step for this thesis project. So figuring out what kind of knowledge underpins coach behaviours seems important, given the link between beliefs and practice, particularly from the teacher education literature. So 3 major themes came out of this first study, and they were thinking and learning about feedback, providing feedback, and evaluating feedback. So one really interesting finding that came out of this as an example, under evaluating feedback, the coaches spoke about what some of the barriers were towards athletes actually receiving the feedback that they'd given them. And several coaches spoke about this idea of the participation trophy era. So younger generation athletes receiving trophies for everything they did as a junior, getting an awful lot of praise, getting their tyres pumped up essentially. And they perceived this to be a barrier for these athletes in receiving negative feedback once they made it to high performance levels. So they haven't had experience learning to take criticism or negative feedback or constructive feedback, however you want to phrase it. They haven't had this experience before, so they feel like they should just still be receiving positive feedback, which is a really interesting finding that I hadn't read much about before. I guess the other big finding was that coaches have really extensive knowledge about feedback. So they had lots of different beliefs about what good feedback looks like. Here's a really nice quote that I took from one of the coaches about reception of feedback. So this coach believed that athletes need to be trained in, given methods about what feedback is and how to receive feedback. He says that coaches think about delivering it a lot and put a lot of effort into it, but it's actually a skill to receive feedback as well. So I thought that really nicely reflected the notion that coaches actually consider feedback reception in their day-to-day practice. So to summarise the results in a slide, coaches, as I mentioned, have extensive knowledge about feedback. I could speak for 40 minutes just on what they know. There might also be some examples of misconceptions around feedback. So one example where feedback knowledge was at odds with evidence is several coaches who mentioned, to excuse the colloquial, shit sandwich or the feedback sandwich, which involves providing a negative piece of feedback in between 2 positive pieces of feedback. So it's claimed that this technique can have affective benefits for the learner, like building rapport with the receiver of the feedback. Evidence also suggests that the feedback sandwich doesn't impact post-feedback performance and can actually encourage the receiver of the feedback to overlook the negative feedback and then reach artificially positive conclusions. This was taken from the medical field, so it's not a sport-specific study, but it can start to generate those conversations around evidence versus practice. And the last conclusion that I wanted to draw from this study was that coaches showed really strong evidence of evaluating feedback reception. So pedagogical approaches like questioning or allowing athletes to teach a concept back to check for understanding. And then the more traditionally sports-oriented approaches like observing performance changes or looking at statistics. And then, the coaches also talked about barriers to receiving feedback, like the personality variables that I spoke about earlier. Consistent use of terminology was another one, and the amount of feedback that they gave, specifically to do with overloading the athlete. So that's study 1. Study 2, in which I looked at feedback in a video feedback setting, and then the reception of this feedback by athletes. So I recruited 6 athletes and 6 coaches from an Australian rules football club, and I observed them in those coach-athlete dyads, so 1 athlete with 1 coach at a time, in 6 meetings in total, so 1 per dyad, and those meetings went for about 20 minutes each. I transcribed each of these meetings verbatim and coded them using a coding scheme adapted from a range of literature. And I need to give a shout out to Kieran, who was instrumental in dual coding this for me, as he was with a range of the feedback coding schemes, and did an awful lot of good work in getting inter-rater reliability. So thanks, Kieran. What happened after that was I interviewed the athletes as well. So I'll go into a bit more detail about how this was done. I essentially asked them what they remembered of the coach's feedback. and then finally tested those athletes on a few characteristics. So developed a self-efficacy scale for sport based on guidelines by Bandura. I tested their working memory capacity and their orientation towards receiving feedback using a scale borrowed from the HR literature. Here are the majority of the codes that were used. So descriptive and prescriptive. Does the feedback describe past performance, or does it prescribe future performance? Is there a where to next there? Positive and negative, as I spoke about before, along with autonomy supportive and controlling feedback, and also Hattie and Simply's self-task process, self-regulation scheme. And here's what was found. So the majority of feedback was descriptive in nature, which seems to make sense when you consider the coach is sitting there with a laptop showing footage to the athlete. So they're describing what's actually happening on the screen. It was mostly task-based. It was mostly positive, which mirrors rates found in a training setting. So coaches seem to be around that positive in a training environment, as well as in this video feedback setting. And feedback was much more neutral than it was specifically autonomy supportive or controlling. So rates of autonomy supportive and controlling sat at around 20% each, and the remaining 60% was neutral. So this rate of autonomy supportive feedback was far higher than what was found in a previous study by Halpern and colleagues. But this previous study was done in a boxing setting, and it was a competition. So you can assume that it's a little difficult to compare apples and oranges in that case. All right, what did athletes actually remember? So recall was assessed in two different ways for this study. The first was through idea units. So this is defined as the smallest unit of meaning in an interaction that has some kind of informational or affective value. This has been used extensively in human conversation research and in a couple of sporting studies. So from that Portuguese lab that I mentioned earlier. An example of an idea unit might be, I thought your aerial defending has improved. And then the athlete might recall something like, he said that my aerial defending was pretty strong. So using this idea unit analysis, we found athletes recalled 6% of the idea units that the coach had provided in their feedback. This is a very low number, which might indicate that this method of analysis could be too sensitive and in too much fine-grained detail to be practically useful. It has been used as a method before in sports, so there's some precedent, and it was the best option that we had given previous literature, but it might not be the best measure. So the second measure that was used was to summarize these individual kind of small scale idea units into feedback themes. So using this approach, every idea unit related to the same concept, kicking for example, was grouped into a summarized category. And this also seemed to be what the athletes did naturally. So they provided kind of higher level headlines without the intricate detail. An example of this might be the coach says, great kick, later in the meeting, when we get shot selection like that, it helps the rest of the team. The player just recalls shot selection. So two slightly different pieces of feedback that could be grouped together. When this was analysed in this way, the players recalled about 50% of the feedback themes. So it's a much higher rate, but it still indicates that feedback given certainly doesn't equate to feedback received. Here are the moderator variables. There's a lot to look at. To summarise, there wasn't much variance in the working memory measures. It was fairly similar across the board. There was a really a big ceiling effect essentially on the self-efficacy scale and on the feedback orientation scale. So it was really hard to determine the effect of these variables on feedback recall. But one point of interest you can see highlighted in the red circle was that players rated remembering coach feedback on game day lower than all the other items for the sport feedback self-efficacy scale. So this might indicate that athletes are aware of their fallible recall of coach feedback. Evidence suggests that athletes typically aren't good judges of their mental skills, but this might suggest that these athletes in particular are aware that they can't remember everything. So it's an interesting finding. Certainly needs more exploration though. to summarize the results of this study, there were novel findings for feedback coding. So this is the first time that the types of feedback given in a video review meeting of this nature, it's the first time that feedback's been coded essentially. So it gives a nice baseline for future studies. As I mentioned, the recall showed a summarized pattern. So athletes were chunking feedback into groups rather than giving intricate details. And the idea of athlete characteristics influencing feedback recall needs more attention and more investigation. Study 3. You can't have a favorite child, but study 3 was my favorite study of the 3. It was a lot of fun to do, and it involved listening in to 5 coaches from the one AFL team across 21 games of the 2018 AFL season. So that represents 45 hours of coded audio, which was an awful lot of fun to do. I used the same coding scheme as that used in the second study. And one of the interests of this study was to determine differences in feedback between a winning quarter of football, a losing quarter of football, and again, when the margin is close or when the margin has blown out to a big win or a big loss. And this is the first study from the thesis to be published. This came out in February in Physical Education and Sport Pedagogy. A big thanks to my co-authors, Damien and John. It's receiving a bit of traction at the moment, so it's a nice feeling to have this in print. Here are some of the results. So what kind of feedback was given by these coaches in the different context of a game? It was highly prescriptive. So you might remember that we were looking at around 60% descriptive or 40% prescriptive in a video review setting. This was much higher in terms of prescriptiveness. It was up at 81% for the in-game setting. It was, again, about 60% task-based. It was mostly negative, so 20% negative and far less for positive. We'll see some more examples of that on a graph on the next slide. And coaches were a lot more controlling in this setting than they were in the video feedback setting. So 60% of feedback was seen as controlling rather than autonomy supportive. So this is the first time this has been coded in a sample of AFL coaches and one of only a few examples of this type of study in an elite sport setting. Here are some examples of the feedback that was actually given in game. So you can find this in the paper as well. So autonomy supportive feedback, more like a question. How are you feeling out there with X, Y, and Z? Allowing the athlete to come to some solutions as well as the coach guiding it. Neutral feedback, so neither autonomy supportive nor controlling. We look pretty safe behind the ball. And then controlling feedback, you need to stop giving away stupid frees. So really trying to make the athlete do what the coach wants. Here are a couple of examples of what the results looked like from a visual perspective. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, positive feedback was significantly higher in winning quarters and significantly lower in losing quarters. And the reverse of that was true for negative feedback. So coaches became more negative when the game wasn't going their way. You can see also significant differences for controlling feedback on the right-hand side. So coaches became more controlling, less autonomy supportive in losing quarters compared to winning quarters. And a really interesting finding from this, which hasn't been found before, especially in an AFL setting, but much in sport at all, with the help of Rob Younger, who's a statistician, particularly in AFL football. We found the point of the game where the game's 95% or more likely to result in a win to one team or the other. So by finding this magic number for the start of each quarter, you can determine whether the game's pretty much over. So by a quarter time, if a team is 5 goals up, they're 95% or more likely to win. It's 4 goals up at halftime and 2 goals up at 3/4 time. So you can see here that when the quarter starts with a margin that's considered to be in the balance still, coaches provide significantly more feedback in terms of quantity throughout that quarter. And then the feedback drops away when the game is not considered to be in reach. So you can see this tendency of coaches to want to control at least with the amount of feedback that they give in those tight quarters where the game's still in the balance. So that was a really interesting finding from this study. To summarize the findings, feedback looks different in-game to other contexts. Winning and losing quarters, feedback also looks quite different between those. And the feedback tends to increase when there's a close margin compared to when the game is blown out. So a couple of interesting and unique findings, particularly in an AFL context, but also in an elite sport context in general. So 4 conclusions from the thesis overall, which mirror those questions that I posed at the start. Coach knowledge doesn't always equal coach practice. Feedback given doesn't always equate to feedback received. Feedback varies based on the context. And also athlete characteristics need some more consideration in theories of feedback, particularly in sport. I'll go into each of these in a little more detail now. So, in study 1, coaches could articulate a range of beliefs and knowledge about feedback, and a lot of this was aligned with existing evidence. Some of it also provided new evidence about what expert coaches do. So we need to be sure to position these coaches as experts in their field. They're the best coaches that we have in the country, and so what they do could be considered evidence in the absence of more experimental evidence around what good feedback looks like in a high-performance setting. And this evidence can supplement a lot of that feedback research, which I mentioned as lab-based and could lack ecological validity. However, when comparing this knowledge to observational data in studies 2 and 3, some of these beliefs might not emerge in practice. Now, this needs to be a cautious conclusion because we didn't have an identical sample between coaches in study 1 and the coaches in studies 2 and 3. But they share a lot of similar characteristics. They're Australian team sport high performance coaches, and so there are enough similarities there to perhaps make some tentative conclusions. So an example of where knowledge and practice didn't align was with self-organisation. So coaches in study 1 reported allowing athletes to self-organise, to find their own solutions, rather than being overly controlling or prescriptive with the feedback that they gave. And this would be in line with a constraints-led approach to instruction and feedback, which is in vogue all over Twitter and in some academic research as well at the moment. So the rates of prescriptive feedback at 81% and controlling feedback at 60% suggests that coaches perhaps don't allow athletes to self-organise to the extent that they might have reported. This could, however, and this is a really important point to make, this could reflect the expertise of the coaches. So giving prescriptive feedback, giving controlling feedback could be necessary when time is a critical factor. Players could run back onto the field at any point. The players might need certainty because their physiological arousal is high. They just need to know what to do. They haven't got time to sit down, breathe, self-regulate, and come to their own conclusions. So potentially the coaches are adapting their practice here to be able to allow the feedback to come across. However, we also need to test whether this feedback is actually being received in a competition setting, which future studies can do. The second conclusion that I want to make from the thesis, feedback given doesn't always equal feedback received. The interview data suggests that coaches regularly consider feedback reception as part of their role. Recall was pretty low in the second study. Athletes couldn't recall between 50 and 94% of the feedback they were given, so there's certainly a gap there. In terms of the method, there was a 1-week gap between the provision of feedback by the coach and my interview with the athlete to ask them what they remembered. This could be seen as problematic. There could be some decay of memory over that week, but it's also a fairly ecologically valid period of time. So athletes typically get their video feedback meeting on a Monday. They then go and play a game on perhaps a Saturday or a Sunday. So a 5 or 6 day gap isn't that far removed from a 7-day gap. So it might actually represent a specific interval of time, which is appropriating what happens in practice. Now, athletes might also discount some of this feedback due to this idea of teacher credibility, which we know is important in education. Teacher credibility has a fairly decent effect size in terms of students' achievement. Is this the case in coaching? Do the athletes perceive that the coach is an expert? Do they perceive that maybe they're just waffling on for part of the meeting, or waxing lyrical about when they used to play and back in my day? We don't know what the athletes think about the coaches. So that's an interesting area for future research. And another important point to make is that there are more measures of feedback reception than just recall. Athletes don't get feedback so that they can sit down with a PhD student and rattle it all off a week later. They get feedback so that they can go out, kick more goals, win a game, etc. So looking at performance measures seems to be a really important next step. We tried for study 2, but it was a fairly messy endeavor. So that's an area to look at for the future. The third conclusion, feedback varies based on context. Now, I've alluded to this throughout today's presentation, but here's a bit more of a formal model, almost a traffic light system, if you like. Different rates of feedback are seen in different contexts in which feedback is provided, and sometimes this is quite drastically. So here are some examples on the next slide. So you can see positive feedback, nearly 60% in a video feedback meeting, down to 18% when winning a game, and drops even lower when the coaches are part of a losing game. Similar patterns are seen for controlling feedback. Coaches aren't very controlling at all during a video feedback meeting, and this rises during a game context and rises again over 60% in a losing quarter. And for descriptive feedback as well. So in a video feedback meeting, the feedback is highly descriptive, and this drops right off over 40% in an in-game setting. So there's this pattern of feedback changing quite drastically across quarters. The same for questioning. So the rates of questioning by the coach drops drastically from the video feedback context through to competition environment. So taken together, coaches become less positive, more negative, more controlling, less autonomy supportive, less descriptive, more prescriptive. They ask less questions as the context shifts. Again, the idea of best practice here needs to be taken with a grain of salt, given the lab-based studies where a lot of this evidence comes from. Maybe this pattern represents best practice for the coaches in these studies. So they're the experts. We need to know more about what they're actually doing and what kind of knowledge underpins that. The final conclusion, we need to know more about athlete characteristics. So literature in education, in coaching science, suggests that considering athlete characteristics when giving feedback can enhance its effectiveness. In study 1, the coaches acknowledged the benefits of differentiating feedback for their individual athletes, and they reported several methods of doing so in their practice. Many coaches talk about this idea of learning styles. Up to 60% believe in it, according to a 2018 study. Learning styles have poor construct validity. They can't be measured reliably. They don't produce improved learning outcomes. So this idea of the visual, auditory, kinesthetic learner should be considered with a degree of caution. Perhaps we need to look more specifically at those characteristics that have evidence and investigate those in sporting setting. So we need to know characteristics that are valid and reliable measures of feedback reception, and we need valid and reliable instruments to measure that. So I wanted to end this talk with practical implications. The field of coaching science receives some flack in the literature for being shrouded in academic lingo, not being accessible to practitioners. There's a disconnect between research and practice. So here are a couple of takeaways. If you're a coach or a coach developer, perhaps listening in, here are a few findings that I can give you based on the results of this thesis. So coaches firstly should experiment with methods for checking that their athletes have received the feedback that they've given them. This could be done by asking them questions, allowing them to describe what's happening in a video feedback meeting, or by observing them at training or in competition, which I'm sure every coach is doing anyway. Number 2, coaches can sometimes be poor judges of the types of feedback they give. So this might be improved by reflecting on their use of feedback after a training session, after a game. And this could be done with the help of a peer, a mentor, a coach developer, or just with some audio or video of their coaching. In a video feedback meeting, coaches should adopt a less is more approach to giving feedback. So in study 2, we found a correlation between the number of idea units in a meeting and the amount that was recalled. So coaches should focus on a few key points rather than overloading the athlete with a long meeting and many points. And this is likely to improve the amount of information that athletes remember. And finally, coaches should encourage athletes to ask more questions in video feedback meetings and reduce the number of surface level and closed questions that they ask to athletes. Just to summarize some of the future research that I've alluded to during the presentation, yes, we need to look more at athlete characteristics. We certainly need to look at other sports. So this thesis looked specifically at team sport, but individual sports and how they use feedback is important, as well as looking at grassroots and junior levels. So how do coaches develop as they come through the ranks as well? Developing an intervention to work alongside coaches to help them reflect on their feedback, help them to improve the feedback that they give, and most importantly, the amount of feedback that athletes receive and use appears important. And finding some performance measures to actually evaluate what's happening on the field is one of the most important things that we should do in future research. There you go. That's it. Thank you to all of the people on the screen who've helped me along the way. There are lots of them. The PhD is not a solo endeavor at all. I think we should open up for questions.
Okay,
Right,
well, that was a superb